Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this lecture by Ismail Alatas entitled "The Sacred is in Relatedness, Arabia, Asia as a Geography of Friendship." My name's 𝗂𝘂𝗵𝗺. I'm director of the Asia Research Institute at NUS, which is organizing this evening's lecture as part of the Institute's Muhammad Alagil Chair in Arabia, Asia Studies. Now, while of course being a very exciting prospect in its own right, I should also mention that the lecture this evening follows on from a set of presentations and discussions that have been taking place on the NUS campus at Kent Ridge during the course of today. It's been the first day of a conference on exploring the sacred, people, place, and power in the Islamic Indian Ocean. And that conference continues tomorrow. If any of you are keen for more cutting-edge academic engagement in this field, please feel free to check ARI's website for details on that. But back to the present and this utterly fascinating sounding lecture by Ismail Alatas from New York University, and the commentary to follow by Harini Kumar from Yale University. I definitely don't want to test anyone's patience by talking for too long and holding up things, but I must, of course, give some thanks to people who have contributed in various ways to making this evening's event possible. Let me begin by acknowledging Mr. Muhammad Alagil, who is with us this evening, and whose generous donation made Arabia Asia Studies at ARI and NUS possible. It's with great pleasure that we inaugurate the lecture series in his name. Thanks once again, Mr. Alagil. I also wish to thank Mr. 𝗂𝘵𝗺, director of the Asian Civilizations Museum, I should say, who kindly offered the use of this lovely auditorium here this evening. Clement can't be here this evening, but I wish to also express my thanks to other colleagues at the ACM who are present and with whom we already have enjoyed collaborating through the India-China Studies program, the Nalanda program at the Asia Research Institute. So thanks to you too. Then there's the Asia Research Institute's events team. One of them is brandishing a phone in my direction right now, Valerie Yeoh, but also 𝗂𝘂𝗵𝗺 and 𝗵𝘂𝗺𝗺. Thank you very much for your administrative efforts that make these kinds of events possible, labor that's all too often unnoticed, but on this occasion definitely recognized. Thank you very much. And then of course, Sumit Mandal, who has handled the academic side of things with great care, and whom I'll pass over to now to give fuller introductions to both Ismail Alatas and also to Harini Kumar. So thanks in advance to the speakers too, and welcome everyone again. Thank you.
It's not on. Okay. Good evening to you all. Thank you for making the time to be here. We have a very special evening ahead of us with Ismail Alatas and Harini Kumar. My name is Sumit Mandal, and I hold the Muhammad Alagil Chair in Arabia Asia Studies at the Asia Research Institute, National University of Singapore. The chair has been in existence since 2014 and is tasked with building a comprehensive Arabia Asia Studies program. The aim of our program is to explore and articulate connections and relations across the sea and the land between Arabia and Asia that offer alternative ways of imagining our past and present. To the conferences, workshops, and seminars we already have, this evening we add the Muhammad Alagil Arabia Asia Studies lecture. We plan to invite leading scholars in the field whose work helps us to expand our imaginations. So the lecture this evening, as you can see, is titled "The Sacred is in Relatedness, Arabia-Asia as a Geography of Friendship." Ismail Alatas will speak and Harini Kumar will follow with a reflection on the lecture. Let me share a little bit about Ismail's background before we proceed. Ismail Fadri Alatas is Associate Professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies and History at New York University and a Fellow of the Royal Al Bayt Institute for Islamic History in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. He holds a PhD in Anthropology and History from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and was formerly the Associate Editor of the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society. He's the author of What is Religious Authority? Cultivating Islamic Communities in Indonesia, published by Princeton in 2021, along with many articles, book chapters, and encyclopedia entries. He's currently working on a new book project that explores wilaya as a form of friendship and protection in the Islamic tradition and in Muslim societies. Beyond the professional biography, Ismail, or Aji, the three-letter name by which many know him, has crafted his own geography of friendship, and it includes many friends at NUS and Singapore as a whole. I won't even go beyond the island. There's many more across the world and in the region, of course. In the past few weeks, I encountered many who told me that they would love to show up at the ACM to listen to Aji and say hello. I mention this not only to tell you how friendly Ismail is, but to let you know that a formative stage in his training was at NUS in Singapore, where he did his master's. His lecture this evening is a fitting return to NUS. One of the aims of the Arabia-Asia program is to cultivate younger scholars and expand the scholarship in the field. And in this regard, it is equally fitting that Ismail, a leading scholar of his generation, initiates the Muhammad Al-Agil Lecture in Arabia-Asia Studies. With this, I invite Ismail to deliver his lecture.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you so much, Sumit, for that generous introduction. And it is a profound honor to be here with you this evening. I want to express my sincere gratitude to Dr. Sumit Mandal, Dr. Abdul Jalil, and to you, Tim, and all the organizers for this generous invitation. To be asked to deliver the inaugural Muhammad Al-Agil Arabia-Asia Studies lecture is a privilege I do not take lightly. And it is especially meaningful to be back in Singapore among friends to speak about friendship in a city where I spent 2 wonderful years and which I still think of in many ways as home. And that's partly due to the many friends I have here. So let me take this opportunity to share some reflections from my current project. Over the past few decades, anthropologists and historians have paid growing attention to the global itineraries of people, objects, and ideas. The shift to the global has generated significant critiques. Some, for example, warn us that the global often comes wrapped in a rhetoric of seamless convergence, flattening heterogeneity into a borderless canvas aligned with the logics of empire and capital. Others alert us to the neoliberal and managerial imaginaries embedded in our privileging of flow, network, connectivity. They question whether we can fairly comprehend the global when we think with such concepts. do these concepts render the global as somewhat thin, flat, and fleeting, as opposed to the thick cohesiveness of the local or the national. Yet the many works that have been written over the last decade or so on the history of Arabia, Asia, have shown how this transregional arena is neither thin, flat, or fleeting. It is a thick geography. Mobile actors have produced enduring long-distance social formation, not adequately captured, I think, by the analytics of flow, network, and connection. This thick geography, I think, is a provocation to think beyond these concepts. Its rich history is an incitement to explore alternative concepts and logics of transregional cohesion that do not simply reproduce the metaphysics and teleology of globalization. It is in this spirit that I return to the Ba'alawis, a lineage from the Hadramaut that has long traversed the Indian Ocean, whose history and contemporary activities I have studied for nearly 2 decades. My current attention, however, has shifted to the texts they themselves produced in the 20th century, from hagiographies and histories, poetry and correspondence, to travelogues and novels. Composed across the Malay-Indonesian archipelago, some of these works have been mined by historians as raw data for reconstructing the history of Arab mobility and circulation, usually within the familiar frames of diaspora or globalization studies. But these texts are not mere deposit of historical information. They are conceptual works that postulate particular visions of the world, grounded in religious grammar. But rendering such concepts legible is never simple, because modern secular epistemologies have so often drained religious vocabularies of their socio-political force. And social scientists are often allergic to and dismiss moralizing work even as they tacitly engage in their own forms of moralization. So my current project attempts to approach these works as social theory, not as archival materials, but as social theory. And when we approach them as such, we can begin to ask, how do these texts conceptualize the global or the transregional? Can they unsettle how we usually imagine an integrated world? What analytical optics do they offer that can help us understand the social? Can they suggest alternative ways of writing global or transregional history? These are, of course, big questions, and I do not pretend to answer them adequately, but we need to do our bit if we are to treat Arabia, Asia, not just as an empirical field site, but a theoretical wellspring capable of enriching and productively unsettling our existing concepts. So in this talk, I want to focus on one of the Arabia Asian texts I have been working on, The Crown of Brides, the Taj al-A'ras by Ali bin Hussein al-Attas. Begun in the 1930s and completed in 1954, the gestation of this text spans the twilight of empire and the birth of post-colonial nation-states. Yet instead of imagining the world as a partitioned surface of sovereign territories, as many of his contemporaries did, al-Attas offered a different socio-political imaginary altogether. He envisioned the world as a rhythm of enduring relations unfolding across time and space. What emerges is not a cartography of nations, nor simply a map of a diaspora, but a world in which the measure of socio-political life is not state sovereignty, but the durability of human relations that precede, exceed, and outlast it. The Crown was conceived as an expansion of a 19th century hagiographical monograph, Taming the Heart and the Senses, which recounts the life of the Ba'alawi Saint Saleh bin Abdullah al-Attas of Ahmad Valley in Hadramaut. Ali widened this original text into a vast archive of relational life, reconstructing not only the life of Saleh, but the lives of all those related to him through friendship. Each life becomes a threshold that opens onto others, men and women, Arabs and non-Arabs, Muslims and non-Muslims. In this way, the life of a single saint expands rhizomatically, projecting a geography of friendship that links Hadramaut to Egypt, the Maghrib, the Levant, the Hijaz, the Swahili and Malabar coast, and of course Southeast Asia, stretching from the 16th century to the mid-20th century. And the connective tissue that binds this sprawling world of unfolding relations is the concept of wilaya. So what is wilaya? In Islamic studies and religious studies, wilaya is often reduced to sainthood, a delicate tie between God and a human being, woven through intimacy, love, fidelity, and trust, one that extends into forms of divine care, patronage, and protection. But wilaya gestures towards something far more capacious. It operates as a broader concept or idiom of relatedness, naming asymmetrical ties of loyalty, guidance, protection, and care between teacher and disciple, father and children, patron and client, host and guest, ruler and subject. These ties are not just affectionate, they are sheltering. The wali is one who extends protection to those bound to him in a world otherwise marked by uncertainty. Perhaps we might think of wilaya as a form of protective friendship, though not friendship in the modern sense of equality. Here, asymmetry is posited as the more ideal form. The less powerful flourish through the guidance and protection of the more powerful. This in turn produces a gradation of power, not measured by wealth or political prowess, but by seniority, knowledge, and proximity to other more powerful actors, culminating in God as the most powerful. These friendships exceed kinship, though they may grow from it. After all, kinship itself requires added labor of cultivating trust to solidify into real solidarity. While friendship in this tradition is a same-sex relation, it is the veiled labor of women that is central in sustaining friendship. Women actively participate in this world of wilaya through kinship, as mothers, wives, and daughters whose immobility anchors the mobility of men. Man's capacity to form elective friendship, to travel, host, and be hosted rests on women's stabilizing labor. If this seems like exclusion, I think it is a much more complex one, perhaps less of a banishment than a subsumption. Now, the lives recounted in the Crown follow a rhythm. The young seeking friendship with the more powerful elders and later becoming themselves the sought-for protector of a younger generation. Yet even in maturity, one remains in need of protective peers, those of comparable standing whose advice can compensate for the inevitable passing of elders. Thus, wilaya gives form to both asymmetrical and symmetrical chains of friendship. And in the Crown, Al-Attas uses the 19th century Saint Saleh as his point of departure to chart both the vertical ties between generations and the horizontal ties within them. Here, the significance of an individual is never intrinsic, but always relational. A life is worth narrating because of the friends it binds together. Sanctity in this tradition is not a quality inhering in a person, but as emerging from relatedness. If Jonathan Zay Smith famously framed the sacred as a situational effect produced through emplacement, which of course has been useful in destabilizing the Eliadean substantialist notion of sacrality, the Crown, I think, pushes beyond this, urging us to think of the sacred not only situationally, but relationally. The sacred here is not a thing located in a place or a contextual situatedness, but a rhythm of relation, a rhythm of sidq, sincerity and truthfulness, and of shafaqah, tenderness and vigilant care, both of which, of course, give us two terms for friends in Arabic, sadiq and shafiq. This view is perhaps closer to the philosophers Michel Serres' deathbed intuition of religion as a ligature that tie the immense and the infinitesimal, that condense the immeasurable into the tiniest gestures of ordinary life. At the heart of friendship lies reciprocity. But what Wilaya renders intelligible is that this is not the reciprocity of contract, not a calculation of equivalence or a precise estimation of values. Instead, it is a circulation of favors and care that resists quantification, whose end is not profit, but the simple desire to please. This engenders what the anthropologist Julian Pitt Rivers called a circuit of grace. Now, it is difficult to define grace, Pitt Rivers wrote, the only general rule being that grace is always something extra, something beyond. It is inspired by goodwill and demands nothing more than reciprocity of feeling, an acknowledgement, like thank you, not a commensurate return. Unlike contractual exchange, there is no need to determine in advance what the value of the return shall be or when it shall occur. What the Crown made clear is that to participate in this circuit, one must cultivate humility, deference, generosity, and eagerness to seek attachment. In contrast, dispositions such as envy, hasad, arrogance, kibr, resentment, heged, and suspicion, su'ud dhann, are named the vices that isolate the self within its own injury, breaking the rhythm of affection and reciprocity on which moral life depends. Now, the Crown expands this relational insight by showing that this circuit of grace is not confined to local settings, but scales outward across oceans and continents. Here, Wilaya becomes the grammar through which the cohesion of trans-regional life is made intelligible. The Saint Saleh himself is described as an axial saint, the 𝗂𝗵, the spiritual pole around whom the affairs of the age revolve and whose, quote, influence spread throughout the universe. Beneath the axial saint lies a complex hierarchy of interrelated saints, the autad, the pillars upon whom the stability and security of the world rest. This framing situates Wilaya not as a parochial grammar, but as one that is global or even cosmic. What sustains the world is not state sovereignty, capital, or international regimes, but divine grace, fadl, that moves relationally through the rhythms of friendship and its capacity to scale outward. This circuit materializes and is sustained through ongoing practices of circulation, three of which I want to discuss briefly as illustrations: the circulation of bodies, of letters, and of gifts. Each materially enacts and gives expression to the grammar of Wilaya, forming an interplay between theological and moral imagination and material practice. Together, they materialize a lived geography of friendship, where the sacred shimmers in the rhythm that bind life together. Of course, given the constraints of time, I can only touch on each of these in a very cursory way. So let me begin with the circulation of bodies. To read the Crown is to be struck by the density of human mobility that resists any simple or fixed directionality. There are 266 individuals with full biographical entries, including 12 women, born in the Hadramaut, the Hijaz, Swahili, Malabar Coast, the Deccan, the Malay-Indonesian archipelago. While the women do not travel, all the men undertake long-distance journeys to befriend those who are more powerful. The Saint Saleh himself is portrayed as a seeker, traveling in search of friendship. He journeyed across Hadramaut, Yemen, and the Hijaz to cling to more powerful figures, a practice known as mulazama. In time, he himself became a destination, drawing individuals from different walks of life, backgrounds, and social statuses who came as students, visitors, and supplicants. Those who befriended him then carried that friendship onward and outward. They traveled, settled in new places, and drew seekers of their own. The trajectory of Ahmad bin Hamza exemplifies this dynamic. When a dispute over property and mounting financial strain left the young Ahmad distressed, Saleh instructed him to travel to Java. In Java, Ahmad grew wealthy through trade, but he also clung to several powerful figures. In time, he founded a Zawiya, a Sufi center in Batavia, where his gatherings drew streams of seekers, including a Dutch police officer who became his devoted friend. And of course, the Crown gives a biography of that Dutch police officer. In the next generation, Abdullah bin Muhsin likewise traveled to Java, where he clung to Ahmad. After Ahmad's death, Abdullah became a destination in his own right. His home in Bogor, West Java, turned into a magnet for seekers. Among those who came to live with Abdullah was the Meccan scholar Hasan Fadak, who made 3 extended sojourns in Bogor, lasting a year and 2 years each, after serving as the principal religious advisor to King Faisal of Iraq. Upon returning to Mecca, Fadak became an imam of the Grand Mosque. What sustained this circuit of mobility was a system of hospitality. The Crown celebrates an individual less for asceticism than for generosity and the capacity to host. Hotels do not exist in its moral geography. For to pay for one's own lodging would be to fall back into the register of contractual exchange. Hospitality, of course, involves reciprocity, but not of the calculable kind. Its reciprocity unfolds across time and space. Today one hosts, tomorrow one is hosted, but there is never any guarantee. What is important is the reciprocity of the heart, the gratitude of the guest and the generosity of the host. Gratitude could take the form of voluntary service, becoming a scribe, an attendant, or a companion to the host, understood in itself as a mode of enhancement. Generosity, in turn, requires the host to maintain the material infrastructure of hospitality, which is why the homes of these powerful figures, whether in Arabia or in Southeast Asia, were often spacious with distinct areas reserved for guests. This suggests that the circuit of grace rests on a foundation of contractual exchange, which provides the financial means to extend hospitality. But this financial basis remains largely outside the moral frame of the Crown. What matters is the conversion of wealth into hospitality and hospitality into friendship. Wealth gains its social value only when transformed into acts of generosity. Dignity arises when resources are invested in patronage rather than hoarded as property. This value transformation depends on the work of women, on the preparation carried out by wives, mothers, and daughters who make the home a place of welcome. The mother of the Saint Saleh, for instance, is described as serving the guests as, quote, as the mothers of the believers would, so that her son's house became a space of moral exchange and repose. Her labors made possible the very virtue of generosity for which her son was praised. In this sense, women quietly sustain the world of wilaya, although their labor is subsumed into a male-centered narrative of virtue. Let me now turn to the second circulation, that of letters. The Crown is replete with personal correspondences linking Arabia and Asia. These letters are performatives of friendship. They enact and reinforce bonds of affection and loyalty across distance. Through their flowery and heartfelt prose, correspondents render the faraway emotionally near. Here is one example to illustrate how these letters stretched an embrace across space, mentoring from afar and binding younger men into a circuit of grace. The practice of mulazama, of clinging closely to a more powerful figure, often took the concrete form of serving as his scribe. So the junior who clung to the more powerful figure would serve as his scribe. It was through this act of service that younger men embedded themselves directly in the communicative circuit of wilaya. For example, a young man by the name Ali bin Hussein became the principal scribe of the Saint Saleh, and many of Saleh's letters end with the deferential line, quote, "And the writer of this letter, your son Ali, sends his greetings and requests your righteous prayer." In other words, Ali did not merely record Saleh's words, he stitched himself into Saleh's relational web. Letters also reveal a belief that the hearts of friends could remain mysteriously synchronized across distance. The Crown recounts how Hussein bin Muhsin in Hadramaut injured his leg and wrote to his friend Ahmad bin Abdullah in central Java to request prayers. Before that letter reached Java, another letter had already set out. Ahmad too had dislocated his leg and was writing to Hussein to ask for prayers. The two letters crossed at sea, an uncanny simultaneity taken as evidence of their intimate bond. The mirroring affliction and reciprocal letters show that correspondence was seen not merely as communication, but as the manifestation of shared lives. And letters were not only intimate tokens, they were instruments of managing households and communities. A traveling man would appoint a trusted friend as the caretaker of his children and corresponded with him to ensure continuity of care. Correspondence also conveyed moral reinforcement. Ahmad bin Hassan, writing from Hadramaut, encouraged his friend Ali al-Habshi in Batavia to spread the call to God. Al-Habshi later testified, quote, "From the moment I read the letter, God opened for me the ability to preach in the Malay language." He cherished the letter so deeply that he kept it folded within the crease of his turban for the rest of his life and asked to be buried with it. Letters were cherished, preserved, copied, compiled, and often appended to biographies as integral parts of a person's legacy. The Crown could reconstruct a vast web of relations precisely because so many people left behind collections of correspondence. These letters were not simply documents of affection. They were vessels of grace, recited in gatherings, kissed, and carefully stored. It is through ink and paper, among other mediums, that the grammar of Wilayah becomes history, maintaining and extending a trans-regional circuit of grace. And by celebrating and reproducing some of these letters, the author of the Crown effectively enjoins correspondence as a way of weaving distant places into an integrated moral world. Let me now turn to my final example, the circulation of gifts. In the Crown, gift exchange consistently reinforced bonds of love and social warmth. The text repeatedly cites the prophetic hadith, "Tahadu tahabu," exchange gifts and you will grow in love, to explain why friends send presents to one another or bring small offerings when they visit. Beyond cultivating intimacy, gifting also functions as a mechanism of protection. Take the case of the Java born Abdullah bin Alawi, who made his fortune in Kolkata and later invested that wealth in public works, building mosques, schools, libraries, and wells, not only in the Hadramaut, but also in Kolkata, Rangoon, and Mandalay. The Crown recounts how during one of his sojourns in India, Abdullah had acquired 2 chests of fine silk brocades as homecoming gifts for his family. Upon arriving in his poor South Arabian hometown of Huraydo, however, he learned that these garments have never been seen. So he held them back out of consideration for local sensibilities. Later, a fellow townsman returned from Java with similar brocades. When the man ignored his counsel not to display them, lest it breaks the heart of those who could not afford such finery, Abdullah responded in a dramatic fashion. He distributed all the silk brocades he had amassed in India to the daughters of the less affluent. Here, gift-giving becomes an equalizer, and Wilayah manifested as guardianship of communal well-being. Gift-giving also extends across seas, weaving bonds among people of disparate regions and religions. During a voyage to India, the same Abdullah invited the British skipper for breakfast, serving him a spread that included a disk of precious Hadrami honey. Enamored by the honey, the skipper asked to buy some. Instead, Abdullah gifted him 10 large containers on the spot. The next day, the astonished skipper reciprocated with a beautifully carved red box containing an agate tea set, a remembrance of me with you. Abdullah accepted the gift with gratitude, yet upon arriving in Bombay, he gifted it onward to a local Hindu dignitary. Through this triple exchange, a single act of kindness multiplied, binding strangers across land, sea, and religious difference into a shared circuit of grace. Crucially, many accounts of gift-giving in the Crown are explicitly triangular, involving not only giver and receiver, but God as the social third. When the daughter of a Parsi Raja of Kathiawar lay gravely ill, her mother pleaded with Muhsin bin Umar of Baroda to pray for her. Muhsin agreed, raised his hands in supplication, and the girl rose immediately, prompting both mother and daughter to embrace Islam on the spot. Here the gift was not cloth or coin, but a prayer. And the counter gift was gratitude, conversion, and enduring allegiance. The triadic structure is unmistakable. Human generosity prompts divine intervention, which in turn rebinds humans to each other and to God. The most emblematic gift that instantiates the grammar of wilaya is the khirqa. Defined as any article of clothing worn and then bestowed upon another, the khirqa incorporates the receiver into the donor's protective circle of friendship. Its value lies in the fact that it has been worn, saturated with the donor's self, his scent, sweat, the trace of his body. Its bestowal is a performative act of enfoldment, accompanied by words, anta minna wa ilayna. You are of us and return to us. The khirqa is normally given downward, from the more powerful to the less powerful, to materially express patronage and protection, though it is also exchanged between equals. Thus, the Saint Saleh and his brother Ahmad mutually clothed one another to symbolize their commitment to live and die in parity and mutual protection. The Quran recounts numerous instances of reciprocal khirqa among peers of equal standing, noting formulaically, quote, after having mutually exchanged khirqa, they lived and died upon this relationship. Distance posed no obstacle to the transmission of khirqa. In the 12th century, Abu Madian sent a khirqa from Tlemcen in Algeria to Muhammad bin Ali in Hadramaut. In the 17th century, Muhammad bin Alwi of Mecca sent one to Abdullah bin Alwi in Hadramaut. And in 1892, Ali bin Muhammad in Hadramaut sent one to Muhammad bin Aydrus in Singapore. Significantly, the khirqa never circulated through the postal service. It had to be delivered by the hand of a trusted third party. Its circulation was inseparable from embodied co-presence, from the ritual act of clothing itself. And by the way, here you can see how the turban of the Saint Saleh circulated across Arabia, Asia, as it is handed down across 4 to 5 generations. So, gifts in the crown reveal a moral world in which circulation is not governed by contract or accumulation, but by generosity, guardianship, and care that extend reciprocity beyond closure. They point to an economy of excess where generous exchange is the very tissue of communal continuity, rather than a separate sphere of calculation. Gift giving in this sense is not ancillary to history, but its very medium, a dialectical interplay of the moral grammar of wilaya and the material practice through which friends produced the fabric of their world. All in all, these examples show how the crown foregrounds wilaya not simply as a theology of sainthood, but as a social grammar, one that renders particular forms of moral relation intelligible, meaningful, and commendable. The text does not spell out this grammar through explicit argument or doctrine. Instead, it lingers over the rhythms of lives lived in relation and over the transregional worlds that those rhythms quietly bring into being. The Arabia-Asia conjured by the crown is, at its core, a geography of friendship. In this vision, the sacred inheres in relatedness itself, in the gestures of care, remembrance, and reciprocity through which life holds together across distance. By foregrounding wilaya, texts like the crown enrich how we might write about and theorize the global or the transregional. By foregrounding relation over connection, excess over equivalence, and continuity over rupture, each of which also reorients how we think about the sacred. So I want to conclude by turning to each of these 3 points to draw out their broader conceptual and methodological implications. Let me start with relation over connection. To think in terms of relation is, first of all, to think about persons and regions as constituted through relationalities, as opposed to presume them as already formed discrete units that are only linked externally, which is what the term connection actually suggests. In other words, if connection reflects a substantialist ontology in which entities precede their connection, relation foregrounds dynamic co-constitution. Persons and regions come into being through the practices and relations that tie them together, that tie them to others, God and human, teacher and disciple, host and guest, patron and protege. Secondly, to think in terms of relation is to think seriously about asymmetry. And asymmetry is not always a flaw. As the grammar of Wilayah makes clear, asymmetry can serve as the very canvas of moral relation. Saints protect, patrons shelter, elders guide, mothers nurture, wives cook, and dependents flourish through their attachment to those more powerful than themselves. To depend on someone is to learn how to become dependable for others. Hierarchy here is lived as hope, promising security, dignity, and enhancement through support and protection. Taking Wilayah seriously, therefore, requires us not to only think about relationality, but to rethink asymmetry and dependence against the analytic egalitarianism that have come to dominate the social sciences, particularly after 1968. That moral rejection of hierarchy grew alongside neoliberal capitalism and computational thinking. It foregrounds the commodity form, making all things equivalent and tradable. It flattens and conceals deep structural inequalities under the guise of normative equality. And it erodes clear lines of responsibility and accountability once tied to a hierarchical order. Texts like The Crown discloses what such negation misses. Asymmetry as care and protection, dependence as a condition of flourishing, and patronage as responsibility, one that becomes exploitation only when the more powerful fail to uphold their duty, leaving hierarchy without reciprocity. This immanent rhythm of care, protection, and reciprocity, through which the sacred continually takes form as a shared life of dependability, is a slender but supple thread that slips through the language of network, flow, and connectivity. The second is excess over equivalence. Modern social science has often framed exchange in terms of equivalence, a balancing of accounts, a return commensurate to what was given. Marcel Mauss himself wrestled with this tension. The gift is voluntary, yet obliges return. Many readers of Mauss emphasize reciprocity, sidelining generosity. Yet the gift is perhaps best understood as a double transaction, in which reciprocity is conditioned by generosity, and exchange always bears an asymmetry that exceeds utilitarian rationality. What the grammar of Wilayah makes intelligible is that what animates social life is not equivalent reciprocity alone, but the excessive, the over and above, that resist calculation, the gratuity of gesture, obligations that far outlast immediate returns, and the surplus that sustains hospitality and prestige while marking meanness as the true deficiency. It renders visible that excess is not an embellishment of reciprocity, but the very principle upon which relatedness endures. Friends give more than is due, and patrons extend protection beyond the needful. These gestures affirm that bond persists through what cannot be calculated or guaranteed. Perhaps this is what the sacred is, not a realm apart from the profane, but the relational surplus of the mundane that binds the immanence and the infinitesimal, that condense the immeasurable into the ordinary. Finally, continuity over rupture. Anthropology and history have been fascinated with rupture, God knows why. Epistemic breaks, invented traditions, sudden transformation, while treating continuity with suspicion. Continuity, whether the persistence of the structuring grammar of kinship, honor, or in my case, Wilayah, is often dismissed as ahistorical, functionalist, ideological, and scandalous, you name it. But grammatical continuity is the very condition of social intelligibility, the medium through which value, obligation, and order are reproduced across generations. Such continuity is not an inert survival, but fragile achievements, the outcomes of people's labor to reenact moral schemes in history. What endures are not rigid institutions, but a social grammar that persists not by escaping change, but by inhabiting it. Actors work to produce relatedness across generations, adapting it to new circumstances without breaking the underlying grammar, though they always modulate it in light of changing context. Continuity here is not the negation of history, but its rhythm, the patterned recurrence of obligation, the ongoing work of keeping ties alive, and the sustaining of communication and circulation in the face of uncertainty and dislocation. Perhaps the sacred, too, is rhythmic, not only an exceptional event, the numinous, the collective effervescent, but a pulse that animates repetition, the recurring visit, the meal, the prayer, the letter sent and answered, the daily companionship, the annual commemoration. Its continuity is fragile. Its beat can be interrupted and subsumed by other rhythms because humans live a polyrhythmic existence. Every reenactment of a social grammar is hazardous. It can jeopardize, falter, misfire, or even undo the very relation it seeks to sustain. So continuity here is not static endurance, but the persistence of the risky labor of maintaining the rhythm of relatedness through distance and difference. By composing the crown, Al-Atas was himself striving to reproduce that grammar, carrying its pulse forward into future generation, despite the fractures of time and the partitions of space. This labor of world-making ought to continue, for no world exists apart from the hands that weave it, and no grammar persists apart from the life that enacts it. So the methodological implication is clear. To take concepts like wilaya seriously is not simply to treat it as an ethnographic or historiographical or theological curiosity, but to recognize it as a conceptual resource for writing history. It is an incitement to write histories and ethnographies that track not only the flows of capital or the networks of empire, but also the fragile rhythms of friendships that have long bound humans together across regions and generations. Ultimately, to do so is to widen our sense of what counts as social or political theory, and to acknowledge that the history of Arabia, Asia, and the archives of saints and disciples are also sources for theory building, one that can help us understand how people have imagined and attempted to live a global or a trans-regional otherwise. As the political theorist Wendy Brown reminds us, theory does not merely describe the world. Theory does not merely describe the world. It reconfigures the conditions through which the world becomes thinkable. Theory does not describe the world. It reconfigures the conditions through which the world becomes thinkable. In other words, theory performs a labor of imagination, an act of renewal. So to turn away from these archives in the name of sobriety, to dismiss them as mere romanticization, or to read them only with the hermeneutic of suspicion that foregrounds the question of power and exploitation and domination, is not just an analytical deficiency, but an ethical abdication that overlooks the very practices of care, affection, and protection through which humans have long imagined their world and sustained their social life. Thank you.
Thank you, Ismail. Let me now introduce Dr. Harini Kumar, who will be giving a brief reflection. Harini Kumar is a postdoctoral associate at Yale University's Institute of Sacred Music and a lecturer in the Department of Anthropology. Her research focuses on Islam and Muslim societies, material culture, gender, kinship, ethics, and mobility. She's currently completing her first book manuscript, Formations of Tamil Islam, Religious Belonging and Placemaking in South India, which is an ethnographic study of how Tamil-speaking Muslims construct Muslim subjectivity and modalities of belonging that exceed the essentializing categories of Hindu nationalist discourse. Her new project on transoceanic Muslim mobilities explores the connections between South and Southeast Asia and the Americas through the enduring legacy of a 16th century Sufi saint. And I welcome Harini.
Thank you so much, Professor Alatas, for that engaging and really conceptually rich talk, and for making us think anew about such long-standing trans-regional ties. And of course, thank you to the organizers for the honor of the invitation to give these comments. I just have a few broad comments about your interventions, and I'll end with some questions just to open up the discussion. And these are really meant as a sort of invitation for you to say more about the larger project and its stakes. So Dr. Alatas begins by rightly critiquing the language of globalization as insufficient. And of course, it's insufficient on many counts, not least because of the inherent inequalities, hierarchies, and precarities that are often hidden away. To take a well-known example that everyone in this room will be familiar with, Amazon's so-called magic of on-demand purchase and delivery model has been touted as a globalized logistical revolution. However, the myth of magical seamlessness hides the unequal, invisible pathways of mediation, not least the existing labor inequalities that such global logistical expansions reproduce. So in many ways, neoliberal capitalism has a lot to answer for behind this smokescreen of magical seamlessness. But this neoliberal idiom of globalization obscures something else, namely an older, more enduring world stretching from Arabia to Asia that produces a different version of the global and vision of the global, and in turn demands a different set of conceptual tools of grammar to understand it. While not dismissing the very real and material consequences of neoliberal capitalism, Dr. Alatas asks, what if we were to think about hierarchies and asymmetries from a different angle entirely? Instead of exploitative labor, what if the operative framework is wilaya, a moral and social grammar of friendship, generosity, hospitality, humility, care, and protection? What kind of delicate labor is needed to make this possible? And how can hierarchy be rethought as ethically generative? Dr. Alatas explores these bold provocations with a great deal of care, and in many instances, artfully mirroring the acts of care with which people in the crown engage with the world. And I see you making two key interventions. The first is, of course, to take seriously the texts produced by the Hadrami diaspora as theoretical and conceptual tools, and not merely archival resources. You say quite powerfully that these texts are not passive deposits of information, but active world-making projects grounded in religious idioms and practices. The second intervention is, of course, the concept of wilaya itself as a moral grammar, wherein circuits of hospitality and reciprocity are sustained by mobile individuals across hierarchies. You invite us to sit with the asymmetries inherent in wilaya and resist the urge to straighten them out into some sort of transactional reciprocity. Your paper invites us to think of reciprocity as a form of grace, or as a form of care, and excess of giving that are not always tied to profit. Friendship within the moral grammar of wilaya demands that one inhabit these forms of relatedness, of affection, dependence, and protection, and not always seek equality and symmetry. It emphasizes dependency over self-sufficiency, social solidarity over social estrangement, and so on. So the circuit of grace that Dr. Alatas talked about is not localized, but global and cosmic, expansive across time and space, and of course, sustained above all through a labor of care. In recent years, scholars of political theology have argued that the secularized social sciences too often characterizes Islam through the language of crisis and rupture. And I see Dr. Alatas's reading of the Crown of Brides also pushing against this characterization, and instead asking how various forms of relatedness are forged through friendship, obligation, and hospitality that endure across time despite epochal events, such as the rise of nation states. Dr. Alatas is also careful to note, and I agree, that these relations are often fragile and susceptible to fracture. What does it mean, then, to dwell in this form of world-making? The anthropologist Hussein Agrama recounts the story of a devout Egyptian Muslim woman who routinely undertook the Coptic fast of Saint Mary. Many others, including her own children, continued this tradition after her death. Agrama speculates that this interreligious fasting is a kind of embodied friendship, a form of care, of ethical practice that subsists below the register of explicit claims-making, and thus better discerned through observing everyday sensibilities, habits, and dispositions. Such friendship cannot be learned through doctrine, as Dr. Alatas pointed out, but through living and learning to live in an exemplary way. I bring up this example because I see the people in the Crown perhaps engaging in similar kinds of practices that cannot be understood through the lens of the modern state or captured in scholarship that still subscribes to a form of methodological nationalism. And I engage with something similar in my own research on Tamil Muslim belonging in South India. I ask how we can understand contemporary Muslim life outside the shadow of a racialized Hindu nationalist discourse. Indeed, Hindu nationalism is an attention-seeking and oppressive force. But Muslim life cannot be understood merely through oppositional categories of dominance and resistance, or the totalizing logics of majoritarian oppression. In this context, I argue that a different approach is warranted, one which remains attentive to the ongoing politics of erasure, but one which also takes into account longer histories, genealogies, and forms of relatedness through which Muslims orient themselves simultaneously to an Islamic, Oceanic, and Tamil milieu. And of course, this relatedness includes longstanding ties that predate the nation state and fostered through affective attachments to landscapes, saints, the Islamic tradition, and so on. And such forms of life also rely for their vitality on a range of resources that cannot be captured by statist projects or the modern discourse of the rights-bearing citizen. So for me, it was particularly exciting to engage with your paper and consider what you call alternative social or societal imaginaries. And despite the Crown being written at the dawn of Indonesian independence in the mid-20th century, the text takes us through a sort of unfolding of an alternative imagination that is not fixed to the emergent sovereign territory, but unfolds rather through moral relations across time and space. So before I get into my questions, I just wanted to offer some reflections on Wilaya as it intersects with ethnographic practice. If on the one hand, ethnography is a mode of attention to the world, and if ethnography is about cultivating a form of attentiveness, on the other hand, it is itself a form of relatedness, a deeply enriching one, but one that also needs constant labor to sustain. As ethnographers, we are witness to many acts of generosity and hospitality, without which we simply wouldn't be able to do the work we do. In Singapore, for example, where I most recently spent some time in the summer for research, it was a short trip, but so many people mobilized to help me out of just sheer goodwill and generosity and giving of their time and knowledge. And some of them are actually in the audience here today. And so in turn, we are also deeply embedded in these longstanding interpersonal and reciprocal relations over time and space beyond our research agenda. And this is something I think a lot about, especially given ethnography and anthropology's sort of deep embeddedness in forms of colonial power. And this is not just about how to repay one's generosity, But what does it actually mean to reciprocate that generosity? Right? So I think maybe a concept like wilaya also has deep methodological stakes and can help us rethink the ethnographic endeavor itself. And the specific challenges, of course, of doing an ethnography of religion, especially due to the rationalist assumptions of social scientific scholarship that are often at odds with the phenomena that one might encounter while doing research on religion. And of course, the assumptions that our knowledge of reality can and should be traced back to observable and measurable phenomena. But observation alone does not account for a whole range of experiences that we or our interlocutors might experience. So I have a lot of questions. I'll just stick to a few for now just to open up the conversation. I'll start with a question about one of your key interventions about inhabiting asymmetrical power relations. You say that the relations of patronage are fragile and require delicate labor to maintain, and indeed, wilaya as a concept or embodied disposition breaks down if the more powerful fail to uphold their duty of protection and acts of care, right? And in a similar way, anthropologists have shown how friendship and mutual webs of reciprocity are not always virtuous. They can be harmful. They're not always nourishing. More recently, 𝗬𝗲 𝗬𝗏, the Islamic studies scholar, has also used the concept of wilaya to explore both the promise and the peril of Hindu-Muslim friendship during colonial modernity, and how it's often, friendship is often fraught with power, right? And you, of course, point us to examples in the Crown where this is constantly being negotiated. So there's clearly room in the moral grammar of wilaya for tension, for ambiguity, and for unpredictability. And my question is how these, if you could say more about how these dynamics are being worked out between Muslims and non-Muslims, but also among Muslims perhaps of different madhabs, and perhaps even it's sort of caste-like distinctions that exist in Muslim societies across the world. In other words, both the potential and the tensions inherent perhaps in wilaya, and the potential it has, of course, to cut through the enduring asymmetries, but also the tensions that one constantly has to negotiate and questions of power. My next question is about the gendered nature of wilaya in the Crown. And you touched upon this in this presentation, and this is really, again, an invitation to just say more. We know across different contexts that women's agentive practices have historically been undervalued and invisible, but at the same time, scholars have questioned dominant analytical frameworks of women's labor as inherently exploitative and have cautioned against reducing women's labor to productivist logics. And you say that in the Crown, masculinity signifies not command or possession, but protection, humility, and care. And this gendered division of labor sustains wilaya. And especially since we don't have access to women's voices in this particular text, I'd love to know how you are thinking about gender here, and whether women were also engaged in forms of relatedness outside of the kin relations that you're talking about, and perhaps how they negotiated this moral labor. And does the Crown say anything at all about matrilineal practices? And I ask this because, of course, this is very much a part of the Indian Ocean world, coastal Muslim communities in the Indian Ocean, especially of the Shafi madhab. And I wondered also how women might have thought about mobility beyond sustaining men's mobile lives, because it's certainly the case that one's sensibility can be deeply attuned to mobility, even if one is not mobile herself. And I'll end now with perhaps an unfair question about the broader stakes for all of us today of an Islamic ethical tradition and its bearing on the modern world. I do think, along with you and other scholars, that the Islamic tradition can help us better understand the modern present. And this has certainly resources to offer, and we've seen that really powerfully in your talk today. So what potential does or can wilaya have in this unequal world that we inhabit, both inside and outside the academy? I ask this question because wilaya is such a wonderfully capacious concept. And also, since we have an audience here from different walks of life, how can we think with wilaya today, whether in our personal capacities or in the public sphere? I know this is a big question and the answer is context dependent, but I'd love to hear you say more about inhabiting wilaya, and in turn, what are its political stakes or promise? And in a way, I'm also thinking here with the distinction that Talal Asad has made between democracy as a political system of the state, and which is fundamentally exclusive, and a democratic sensibility as an ethos, which rests on the notion of mutual care and greater inclusivity. And he asks whether a state system which maintains a monopoly on politics ultimately undermines a democratic ethos. So I wonder whether the grammar of Wilaya helps us get to this democratic ethos, where mutual webs of care and friendship are foregrounded in our everyday social and political life. Thank you.
Got it. Thank you both. I think Harini's already asked a number of questions. I thought I might do so as well, but given the time, I think maybe we could start with you responding to Harini, if you like, and then open up to the floor.
Okay. Thank you. I'll try to be brief. First of all, thank you so much, Harini. That was wonderful. Those were wonderful comments. I mean, as a project that is still its infancy, this is exactly what I need, because it's still very much an exploratory paper, and which I hope to develop further, by looking at other texts as well. You're right in terms of the unpredictability, because see, the problem with this kind of genre, right, when we read it, is that genres like hagiography, manaqib, is usually, it idealizes the past, right? Because it wants to teach something. That's what the function of the genre is to provide mirrors for people to live their life. So many of the complexities that we see, for example, in other genre like historiography, would be somewhat smoothened and a bit concealed, etc. Which is fine, because every kind of sources, which is why in the broader project I'm looking at different genres, right? Geography, historiography, etc., to tease out the complexity. Now, you're right that I read Sher Ali Tarin's book, and he tried to discuss wilaya in the introduction, but then he did not really develop. Yeah, it falls out from the frame rather quickly, which I thought was quite unfortunate, because you're absolutely right that this French. I mean, we can see in the text like the Crown, there are Muslim, non-Muslims, friendship, and of course you can see that the author is quite careful in terms of, okay, if your salvation and your happiness is tied to this, you relating to some powerful person, would difference of religion precluded you from that friendship? But I think in many of the stories that we've seen that I've seen in The Crown, no, that you can actually get something, even if the benefits is worldly, for example. That's how the tension is actually resolved. That the benefit is not in the hereafter, but in the world. So he lives a good life in the world. But if you do not take the shahada and do not convert into Muslim, then that's another matter. But of course, Sufi authors like Ali bin Hussein Atas would, of course, refrain from saying that somebody is going to be damned or not in the hereafter. He does not pay attention to this. Yeah, I need to think more about the matrilineal practice. As far as I remember, we don't have that. But of course, this text in itself is already a departure from many of the Ba'alawi texts, right? For example, in the genealogical text that Professor Ho Eng Seng discussed, women are not even there. But in the Taj al-A'ras, there's like 8 women with full biography. So that in itself is already something, right? Because the logic is friendship, and male-female friendships are just not possible under Islamic law. That's not acceptable, right? So which is why only women who have relation, a final or agnatic relation can actually befriend us. And even when you have female saints or female waliya, then some of these other powerful figures would try to marry her to be able to have that access, for example, right? Because this is a question of Islamic law. Finally, in terms of how do we think about wilaya for our life, this is something very I've been thinking a lot about this, and of course, not only I remember somebody like Derrida would say that this is the problem with friendship, is that yes, it somehow can be flattening, but at the same time there's an inherent anti-democratic democratizing force of friendship. But Talal Asad, you're right that in his attempt to find alternative forms of politics outside of the modern state, he said maybe friendship is the only way. But the problem is that we have forgotten how to actually become friends. I mean, friendship in the modern world has been reduced to friendly relation as opposed to a real friendship. I mean, when we read Ghazali's, then friendship is basically like a contract that men and women are related through friendship, and men to men or women to women are through the aqd of suhbah, of friendship. So there's kind of rights and obligations that you need to do, but we have forgotten because a lot of these political forms of friendship and trust network, and I'm not only talking about wilaya, but also think about the corporations in pre-revolutionary France, or other what Charles Tilly calls trust networks that used to be, guild systems, the Freemasonries, confraternities, etc., etc. I mean, these are the forms of human socio-political life that the modern state and the development of the modern state try to destroy, right? Because the modern state wants to monopolize loyalty and forms of protection. Hence, many of these have been criminalized as well. I mean, think of Jatin Dua's work on the IBAN system in the Red Sea, for example, right? Suddenly they become pirates. Or the Cosa Nostra becoming, in North America. I mean, if you're an Italian-American migrant Catholic living in the US, do you think that the police is going to protect you? Of course, you need an alternative form of protection. Or the secret societies in this region, etc. I mean, one of the first things that was passed by the first bill that was passed by the French post-revolutionary French National Convention was the abolition of the corporation. These are the guilds where you entered into a guild and you become an apprentice, and then you under a master you become a journeyman, etc. So all of these are forms of friendships that have been really, in a way, decimated by the modern state, right? And something that is much more personal to me is, I remember in May, my advisor when I was in grad school, Webb Keen, came to New York, and suddenly he wrote me an email. And he said, Aji, are you around? Yes? Okay, let's have coffee. So we have coffee, and then we talked, and he asked me, what are you working on? So I talked to him about this. I'm really exploring what is grace, because it just fell out of the social science altogether, so we don't know how to talk about grace. Although thank you is such a ubiquitous thing, but we don't, Marcel Mauss said that thank you is a sociological delusion. That's what he said, because there's no materiality to thank you. So Webb Keen asked me, okay, so what is grace? Tell me what is grace. I said, what you're doing now is grace. You came to New York. You did not have to meet me. You already supervised me. You got me a job. I'm tenured. And yet you came to New York and you made the point of reaching out to me to ask me to meet me, paid for my coffee, just to ask, Aji, how are you? That's being gracious, and I'm very grateful for that. And so coming to the more personal level, I was so a bit surprised when, nowadays we have to sign contracts, mentor-mentee agreements, just because some professors take months to read the dissertation chapter. So that's why we have to come into contract. Yeah, but our relationship with our advisors, for example, this is not purely professional. There's also personal aspect. I mean, can I be where I am now without Webb, without Eng Seng writing me letters, etc.? No, that's not possible. So these are the things that is very dear to us in the academy. Why I choose this profession is precisely because it allows me to have this kind of. So when you professionalize everything, then you lose this personal dimension. So maybe that's.